says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Giants were on the earth in these days? That is a theological storyline that goes throughout the whole Bible. Modern Western minds and eyes are not understanding the ancient Near Eastern context of the Bible. There's no giants in the Gospels, right? Well, actually, yeah, there are. There were 5 other giants who were also hunting David. We don't fight against flesh and blood, but against heavenly powers, spiritual principalities. The Bible says a lot about giants.
Welcome to episode 12 of the Conspiracy Conversations. This is my favorite big treat. I try to create the kind of shows that if I was taking a trip, going somewhere on a plane, long plane flight, you're going to download some things to watch. And I want to create those kind of shows. This is the kind of content that would be my guilty pleasure, my escape, my thing I'd want to do on a plane, stuff that is so interesting. And we get so kind of bogged down in the microcosm of what's happening minute by minute. And sometimes you go from flying at like 500 feet above the ground and you move it up to 30, 40, 50,000 feet. And you're like, wow, some of these storylines that we're in go way back. There's stuff you can't explain. We like to get into everything from like the JFK stuff and the moon landing and chemtrails and all kinds of things. And I think today's episode is going to blow your mind. One of the best guests I've ever dreamed of having. When I first started this show, this is our 12th episode, but when I dreamed of this for a year or two before we even began doing it, today's show is what I dreamed of being able to do. So excited to be able to do that and to come in and stretch your mind. I was going to show the Rubik's Cube at each one, because if you're coming into this and you're like, I think I understand the world, and you think Rubik's Cubes are red, it's not that you're wrong. It's just that's all you've been exposed to. And we have a guest like we do today. They'll come along and just kind of rotate it a little bit. And you're like, oh my goodness, Rubik's Cubes are red and blue. I had no idea. And again, it's not that even that's wrong. It's just that there's just a lot more going on than maybe just what your parents covered at the dining room table or your school covered as you're going along, or as you and some of these things can't even be explained. But I think you're going to be better off, and I'm better off, and everybody's better off having as much information as possible as you process the world around you. Today's sponsor is brought to you by Kirk Elliott, PhD. He has not one, but 2 PhDs. I've known Kirk for actually 25 years. His dad was a mentor of Stacy and I when we were first married, but he's also probably the best mind on the planet with his 2 PhDs. One of them's in theology, one of them's in global banks and economics, and how inflation works, the calculators they use to actually come up with these numbers. And so he has a great mind for understanding the times we're in, a deflating dollar. And so just kind of, he help you move from these, which are worth less than they were a couple of minutes ago, into something that's tangible. Now, this, gold or silver may not be the thing for you, but we made a move a few years ago to every month strategically be moving from these into what I consider real, tangible assets, bullion. They can be stored in a depository or at your home, either one or a little bit of both. But something that is tangible, that's worth something thousands of years ago, be worth something thousands of years into the future, and you can actually touch it. But protect your IRAs, protect your cash. This is not really a season that I think to be buying jet skis or to have extra things in the garage or something that you're wasting. It's a time to kind of tighten things up and protect yourself, because we got some drunk drivers at the wheel when it comes to our dollars and our finances. And again, Kirk Elliott, PhD, you can go to flyovergold.com. Just fill out some information. There's some videos, some PDFs that you can download, but you can set up a consultation. You give them the information, and they'll just have a conversation with you and say, hey, here's the steps involved to make it very easy. And you can kind of exhale and not worry about that piece anymore. And actually, when you see crazy things on the news, you can be like, hey, I think I'm actually going to be okay. Even if this tanks, maybe I might even be doing better financially. Hard to say, but you don't have to live in fear. And that's really the main thing. It's never a good position to be in when you're fearful and scared. So, really excited about today's guest. He's author of a series called the Chronicles of the Nephilim. It's a category bestseller on Amazon. He's also a screenwriter, major motion pictures, written the screenplays for him, understands biblical worldviews, theology, and history in such a unique way, but it's run through the filter of an incredible storyteller that understands the story arc, the elements involved, and how to actually bring something that seems kind of old and how do I make that make sense, bring it to life and put flesh on it in an incredible way. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation with Brian Godawa. There he is. The studio audience goes crazy. Brian,
hey, David.
They've been camping out for days outside like a Garth Brooks concert, waiting for this episode to start. I'm pumped to have you on today, and I just feel really blessed. We had a series of connections to be able to put us together to be able to do this. I was researching for this, and I watched just a short clip of you from like 13 years ago. You were on as a distinguished visitor series at King's College, and I was watching it. And I'm just watching this, thinking, okay, he's smarter than I'll ever be, and this was 13 years ago. And I'm sure he's learned something since then. I had really better be on my A game and take some extra vitamins. And so honored to have you on as I call you a distinguished visitor on the Flyover Conservative podcast.
You are too kind, but thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yeah, there is. I remember that was a great talk. And by the way, that was before I learned all the stuff that we're going to talk about today. So that's kind of interesting.
Wow, because I would have been intimidated by talking to you then. And, look what you've done since then. It's unbelievable. I'd like to pull up your website. I've got it on the bottom. It's Godawa.com. For those of you that are just listening, you're on the treadmill or something like that. It's G-O-D, like God, and then A-W-A. Godawa.com. We got your website up here. People can register for your newsletter to be able to stay in touch with you as things unfold. But tell us a little bit about your work in this phase of it, and then kind of just maybe just your career in the backdrop before we start diving into giants and history and all kinds of Nephilim and all kinds of just amazing, freaky stuff.
Yeah, well, it is all very relevant actually, because it's all connected to where I am today. And so I'd been a Christian for most of my life since I was in high school. And so that's when I met Jesus Christ. And I also have been a conservative for many, many years, and conservative as a Christian as well, basic evangelical type, reformed type Christian. So nothing bizarre or fancy in my beliefs in that sense. But in fact, in some ways, I'm coming from a more conservative branch of Christianity that does tend to be very skeptical or cautious about the kind of things we're going to talk about. So it took me a while before I sort of embraced it and made the Bible more important than my theology, shall we say? But I've been an artist, and particularly I've been a writer for most of my career, and I had wanted to be a Hollywood screenwriter, and many years ago. So I had actually studied it on my own. I did not go to school for it. And this was back in the day when there was not much out there on how to write screenplays and such. So I just bought the books, went to the seminars and studied it for years and wrote a bunch of scripts. And then finally I got my first movie made as an independent film, which was called To End All Wars. And that was in around 2001. That starred Kiefer Sutherland and Robert Carlyle as in a true story about the Allied prisoners of war under the Japanese during World War II. Mm-hmm. And specifically, if you saw the movie Bridge on the River Kwai, that was a great Hollywood movie. But our story was sort of like the true story that they didn't show you. The suffering, basically, is like Schindler's List for the Allies. And as a matter of fact, it's a true story. And it actually, Christianity was part of the redemption that was brought into the camp. But it's very much of like a Chariots of Fire, where it's just sort of it's a Hollywood, movie, but it does have a Christian worldview in it. And I was very proud of that. And that was my hope and goal for my future, was to be making more, movies like that. And so as the years went on,
wow,
I
pre Jack Bauer, Kiefer Sutherland.
Yeah. Well, no, actually, so we made the movie right before he won the Emmy for 24. I don't know which year that was that he won it.
Okay.
But I remember because he was Jack Bauer, but he wasn't famous yet for it. So I don't know.
Before Jack Bauer became Jack Bauer.
Yeah, I guess.
That's a joke in our family. Whenever we hang up, we're like, okay, we'll see you in 10. They try to hang up first.
Yeah.
Because that was always his thing. Like, how do you get anywhere in LA in 10 minutes for one thing? Because he's always 10 minutes away. But it was in at the beginning of the flip phones, which were kind of cool because like, I'll be there at 10. And like there was like an emotional release. It's kind of like the old phones when you could hang them up. It's like, don't ever call back, and you hang up. And now, with the iPhone or something, you're like, I'm sick of it. Never call back. And you're like, boop. It just doesn't have that punch.
It doesn't have that. That hang. But it's interesting too because I lived in LA for many, many years, and you're right. It's like I just recently saw a movie. I can't remember what it was, but it was taking place in Los Angeles, and they're driving on the highways, and I'm like, that's not LA because there's like no traffic. It's
the only works happens in New York City and LA.
Yeah, and literally every hour of the day is packed highways, right? So there's no such thing as a non-rush hour in
What
LA.
a great movie. What was it like to write that and then to be in a theater and see Kiefer Sutherland playing that on screen, and you're like, this was in my mind. I brought this to life in my mind, but now I'm seeing it on the screen.
Well, it was a dream, and it was a particularly dreamy because I was the only writer on it, and because they couldn't afford to get it rewritten by someone else. If you know anything about Hollywood, scripts go through endless rewriting processes and get changed, and sometimes they get better. Obviously, they do. I can't deny that, but many times scripts are often, shall we say, deflowered of their original genius or creativity that made them so interesting, and that's why you become dissatisfied with a lot of modern ones, right? Because they change them and so much. But they didn't do that with this, and so therefore, and the director followed the writing. He brought his visual genius to the artwork for sure, and he made it much of what it is. But it was the only screenplay in my whole career after that where they stuck so closely to it. So in later years, and even more recent years, it's like, I wrote it, but there's been a lot of changes that I don't agree with or don't like. And it's like To End All Wars was not that way. It's like, and a couple of the points in the movie where the director made some changes, I ended up admitting, what, it's better. I'm glad he did that. Like he made a montage instead of showing all the scenes that I had in there. It would have been more boring, and making the montage made it faster. And I'm like, I guess it was a better decision. So that was, it's a joy to see. Yeah, it absolutely is. And I haven't had that joy since. So sadly, not that there hasn't been some good stuff, but nevertheless, that's sort of my key moment in my writing career. But every career in Hollywood has a sort of times where you have really low job. Even the most successful people have a year or two where they don't get work. And I had a couple of those years. Halfway into my writing career there in Hollywood, and really, it made me rethink and redefine myself. Okay, reimagine myself. Okay, what else can I do that it can expand my writing skills? And I realized that, eventually I would want to write novels. I'm not one of those guys who always wanted to write the great American novel, anything like that. It was more like I have stories that I want to tell. And if I can't tell them in movies, then I guess I'll write them in novels if I have to. It's kind of like that, And that was right around that time period. But that was also around the time period where I came up with what I thought was a cool idea for a Hollywood movie, because my goal is always like Hollywood movie, but with a Christian worldview. And of course, now that's literally almost impossible with all the wokeness that's going on, right? But back then it was sort of like, I came up with a story that Hollywood would love because it's special effects, it's the ancient world, right? Mm-hmm. But also Christians would love because it's from the Bible, and you could sort of meld the two because you could be a little bit more fantastical, being as it was taking place in the ancient world, and there were some wild things going on, according to the Bible, right? And that was the story of Noah. And my script, I actually wrote a script first called Noah Primeval, and of course, I was a little guy in Hollywood, and I started, trying to go around and get interest in the movie, and that's the novel that came out of it. But it was a movie at first, and then I found out Darren Aronofsky was making his movie on Noah, and I thought, he's going to probably get it made, so I lose in terms of getting the story to the screen, and that was okay because that then made me go, okay, how can I get my story out before the movie so that I could at least have the satisfaction of, if there's anything similar, I won't look derivative, right? Because I was truly original. And that's when I decided, well, I guess it's time to go to a novel. And that's what started with my first novel, Noah Primeval, that was like 2011. And that ended up becoming a 8-book series called Chronicles of the Nephilim. And I don't know if you want to play that commercial now for the Chronicles of the Nephilim.
Let's do that. I think it's like a trailer for the series. And what I love when you start reading these reviews, you've got rabid fans that like chomp at the bit for each book that comes out. So if you're a reader out there and you kind of love, when a new, book comes out, my daughter's, that way. She's like, oh, I'd love to come to the thing this weekend, but got canceled because there's a book I've been waiting for. She's like one of these, the disc. So
that's great.
I think you've got a lot of those kind of fans. Let's go ahead and play this trailer.
Yeah.
In the primeval history of Genesis, an ancient war began between the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve. Fallen angels called Watchers begot a race of giants called Nephilim. Their goal, to stop the bloodline of the promised seed. But God had other plans. Chronicles of the Nephilim is a biblical fantasy series of novels that charts the rise and fall of the Watchers and the Giants in the stories of the Old Testament and in between. Read the novel Noah Primeval, the prequel Enoch Primordial, the sequel Gilgamesh Eternal, and more to come. By author and Hollywood screenwriter Brian Godawa. Available on Kindle and paperback at Amazon.com. Go to chroniclesofthenephilim.com and enter a world of ancient history and biblical imagination. That's chroniclesofthenephilim.com.
That's phenomenal. Yeah. And I'm looking at this through the lens of somebody that grew up in it, it's just up to your eyeballs in Christianity, went to Christian school, was on a Bible quiz, a state championship Bible quiz team in grade school. I'd hate to brag, but it's just, facts are facts. And, more flannel graphs than I could count. And some of these things that were the most interesting, I'm sitting there reading them, I'm like, that they would just kind of skip over and didn't have, I think probably the teachers or maybe whatever, just didn't maybe have the mental or emotional vocabulary to process it. And so like, this is very compelling to someone like me who loved God, loved the Bible, but like sort of like cut out all the really interesting stuff and this kind of just the 10 Commandments and stuff you shouldn't do. And like, that's important, but this is an interesting book with really compelling stuff. Yeah. Yeah. So interestingly, that's all related to the origin of this Noah story. When I first started doing the research for it, I stumbled upon a biblical scholar named Michael Heizer. And unfortunately, he just died within the last year. Very sad, of cancer. And he had been writing on this stuff from an evangelical scholarly perspective, which I actually treasure. I love the Bible, and I want all my study of it to be, really rooted in intelligent study, not just this sort of shallow, the way a lot of Christians can sometimes be, where it's like they just read the Bible like it's a magical book and they apply passages magically without understanding its ancient context, right? Right. So I discovered, and there he is, Michael Heizer, and I discovered his writings, which ultimately became the popular book called The Unseen Realm, which I cannot recommend enough to your listeners. If you buy one book other than mine after this discussion, buy that book, because he's a responsible evangelical scholar. So he's got all the bona fides credentials and all that stuff. And that's what mattered to me, because I wanted my research to not be just flights of fancy, but rooted in, and especially because the Bible had some wild stuff in it. So that was where I looked into this passage, probably I would call it the most bizarre passage for me personally in the Bible that I ever read. And it's not the only one, there's a lot of them, but it was the most that I would, as a Christian, as a Bible believer, I believe in the Bible, but you read some stuff that's wild, or you just don't understand, or it just doesn't sound right. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you just, I don't know, maybe someday we'll eventually find out what it means, and I just keep reading, that kind of a thing, Right. But this was the passage, Genesis 6 verses 1-4. And it was about the Nephilim, and that's the whole basis of all that, we're going to talk about here and my series. And let me just quickly read it to you, or most of it. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that
the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide with man forever, for he is flesh. And it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into, that sex, the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And then it goes on to talk about how the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intention and thought of his heart was evil continuously. And God regretted that he created man. And he says, I will blot out man whom I've created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things, for I'm sorry I've made them. And the idea there is that and it goes on to say further in Genesis 6 that the violence of the earth was so great, right? And so, this whole thing, what is Nephilim, and who are these sons of God that are, having sex with the daughters of men? And what does that word Nephilim mean? And, by now most people have basically heard that the basic understanding of Nephilim is that they are giants. Now, there are people and Christians who will argue that they're not, but, and we could talk about that, at some later date, but a study in that concept in the Bible, it basically means giants. Nephilim means giants. It's like, giants were on the earth in these days, and afterward, when the sons of God had sex with the daughters of men? What is that even talking about, right? And Heizer opened my eyes up to this strange passage, but it's not just like it's this strange anomaly that has an explanation. What it turned out to be is it's sort of like a one of the many critical focal points in the biblical text that is a theological storyline that goes throughout the whole Bible, actually. And it links a lot of these passages that we look over that are weird, or we may not even see them because we're not reading closely enough. I'm not talking about some kind of esoteric, Gnostic, secret meaning. It's we with our modern Western minds and eyes are not understanding the ancient Near Eastern context of the Bible, as well as what's behind the original Hebrew and Aramaic behind a lot of the English words that we're reading. And a study of that stuff ends up revealing this very strange storyline that I call the War of the Seed. And, most of us are familiar with, the curse in the garden, where it's actually considered to be the first Bible verse that is messianic. And that's Genesis, I don't have it with me here, but Genesis 3. And that's where he's cursing the serpent and the woman, right? And he says to the serpent, I will put enmity between your seed and the seed of the woman. And you shall bite, or actually it's crush. You shall crush his heel, and he shall crush your head. And that single passage, that messianic passage, is sort of like the storyline that I discovered, that I realized there's more to this than just the story of Noah. And that's what launched my Chronicles of the Nephilim series, which is now up to 8.
That's a theme through all of it. In the trailer there, it talks about the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve. It's like,
yes.
That's the teams. That's the Chiefs and the Eagles in the Super Bowl. That's the two sides as that comes. And I don't know from a practical standpoint how much we can dive into seed of the serpent, and like that's one thing I've always kind of grappled with is, and I don't want to get ahead of you or pull you out of the context, but the actual, from a practical standpoint, because people think of angels, or there's like fallen angels, there's angels here now. Angels could be watching me. An angel will appear to Mary. Those guys. There's the difference between them and then maybe what happened, in heaven of, a third of the angels, like that kind of stuff. And like, what did that world look like in that moment? And are these spirit beings or physical beings? And how could you have a physical child from a spirit being? So like just from a practical, like how things that make you go, and that's why I think a lot of people get to that and they're like, I don't know how that works, and they kind of go on.
Absolutely. So like I mentioned, there's two components, I think, of this Genesis 6 passage that end up, being important as you trace this storyline through the whole Bible. And that is the Nephilim and then the sons of God. Now, there are people who will say, oh, the sons of God are just, they have different views, whether they're human beings in some way that are just being called sons of God. Maybe they're kings who think they're sons of the gods, or that it's a metaphor for righteous men having sex with unrighteous women, which corrupts them in some way. But if you really do a study of that phrase, sons of God, you will see that, and there's a lot of passages in the Bible about it. It's not just a sort of a generic term. It's literally a technical theological term that does in fact mean divine beings from God's heavenly throne in its most generic sense I can say possible. Now, there's a lot of passages. Just briefly, you have Job 1 and 2, where it talks about, in the story of Job, it says that there's a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them. So
Right.
even Satan is a part of these sons of God category. And then there's a really fascinating passage in what is it? I think it's second. I don't always have the things in my finger. 1 Kings 22, where Micaiah sees a vision of God's heavenly host around God's throne, and they're described in the same way as these sons of God. So the idea there is that God has around his throne innumerable numbers of these divine beings that are called heavenly host. They're called sons of God, but they are also called gods in the Bible. Now, this is one of the most shocking things. Well, first of all, before I go there, I just want to say, for people who might say that, the sons of God is not angelic beings, Job 38 talks about God when he created the earth, or the universe, actually. He says that the sons of God were there, that they were morning stars, and they sang together. The sons of God shouted for joy. So there were no human beings there when God was first creating the universe. Those are clearly angelic beings of some kind. Angel is a word. It's a sloppy, loose word that is very generic, but it's applied to these beings as well, meaning an angel is just basically a messenger from God. It could be any kind. It could be a human, actually, an angel, right? But we tend to use the term angel to mean the spirit beings around God's throne. But the part of the revelation is realizing that the Bible has a lot more technical terms that people are not used to using, and so they don't realize it's there. And for people who say the sons of God are humans, this verse in Job talks about how they're morning stars that sing together. What does that mean? Well, the notion in the ancient world, as well as the Bible is, there's a whole Bible study you can do on this that we won't, but the stars are linked metaphorically or literally to divine beings in the Bible and in the ancient world. So they'll often call them stars, right? And so this is another example where the sons of God are morning stars. They're stars, and human beings are not described that way. Human beings, they're not described that way. So there's a long list of these sons of God passages that clearly indicate that they are these divine beings around God's throne. And then that last word, which was one of the shocking things as an evangelical Christian that really turned my world upside down reading the Bible, this will all be connected to as we go on, is that they're also called gods. And of course, as a Christian, we're like, wait a minute, we're monotheists. The Bible doesn't say there are other gods, and we can even quote passages that say that. But the problem is that the Bible does use the term gods, Elohim, not just of Yahweh, who is Elohim, but it applies it sometimes to these heavenly host, sons of God, who are around God's throne. And the big passage there is Psalm 82. And I wrote a whole book on this called Psalm 82 for people. It's a booklet, but it's if you want to go into the in-depth biblical study of this, you really have to do that. So, which is one of the caveats I want to explain here is I'm a storyteller. In some ways, I feel like that's my strongest identity as a storyteller. But I have to admit, I've always been a person who's just, I love the intellectual life. I love academics. I love scholarship, apologetics, philosophy. And so I kind of have this too schizophrenic mind in some ways, bipolar, I don't know, where I'm very artistic. I love storytelling, but I also love the Bible study and scholarship. So I've written both novels and biblical scholarship to back up this stuff, because I know that many Christians, that's one of my dominant audiences. They want to know, where are you getting this stuff? Are you getting it
Right.
from the Bible or not? You got to prove it. And so I prove it. Anyway, Psalm 82 begins like this: God has taken his place in the divine council. That's going to be a key word here. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And then he goes on to say, how long will you judge unjustly? He's talking to these gods. How long will you judge unjustly? I tasked you with righteousness, but you are ruling with wickedness, right? And then he says, I said to you, further in the passage, verse 6, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, and you shall inherit the nations. Now, there's a whole bunch of theology to this, but in short, he's saying, I gave these gods this responsibility of judgment. Now, does that mean that these are gods? Here's the problem, is that as Christians, well, wait a minute, there's only one God, right? But the Bible is definitely using this of other beings. So our key should be not how can we twist the Bible to fit our preconceived theology of monotheism, but how can we fit our theology to incorporate the Bible? Because maybe the way we word things is wrong. And I'm not saying it's not monotheism.
I like what you said at the very beginning. You said the Bible became more important than my theology.
Yes. And so I still believe there's only one creator God overall, but there's nuance here that many Christians need to be aware of, and because they'll react against this so negatively. But when you understand this is what the Bible's saying, we have to adjust ourselves to it. And so the point is this: it doesn't mean you have to conclude that when we say the word gods, what we mean is beings who are omnipotent, all-knowing, all-present, because there's only one God like that. That's Yahweh, right?
Right.
But what it means is what we refer to as angels or other divine heavenly beings, the Bible refers to as these Elohim or gods. And so the conclusion is, you've heard the Bible verse, right? Yahweh is the God of all gods.
Yeah.
Yahweh is the Elohim of Elohim. And what that means is Elohim is a category of existence or being, or as Michael Heizer put it, it's more of a temporal, how can I put it? Not zone, but sort of a spatial location of existence. So what it's saying is any being that is in that spiritual realm can be referred to as an Elohim. For instance, in the Bible, the spirit of Saul that the Witch of Endor brings up, he's called an Elohim. So there you have a dead human he's a shade, he's a spirit, he's called an Elohim. These divine beings from God's throne are called Elohim. So, and there's more study of this that shows you that Elohim is kind of a reference to the spiritual realm. Let's put it as simply as possible. And so beings in this spiritual realm can be called gods. That doesn't mean they're creators like God. That doesn't mean they're all powerful or all knowing or anything. It just means they are divine beings in this spiritual realm. And so that's kind of the biblical context. So therefore, God is an Elohim.
Okay.
But I'm sorry, to put it more precisely, Yahweh is Elohim, but all Elohim are not Yahweh. So therefore, you can say that's why the scripture talks about the incomparability of Yahweh over all the gods, because these gods exist, they have powers in the spiritual realm, but there's nothing like Yahweh in that he alone is the creator, he alone is the sustainer, he alone is the redeemer. Got it? So the idea there is for Christians who are worried and concerned, this doesn't mean it's polytheism or henotheism or henotheism or, Mormonism or anything like that. You have to parse the Bible with nuance accurately within its original context, not our own modern context. So once I embraced that, I kind of started to realize this. A lot of these texts do speak of gods with this sort of spiritual demonic reality, as I'll call it. There's another passage, there's multiple passages about these sons of God and stuff, but one that's I thought was really relevant to my own search was, so you've got these sons of God, and it talks about how they sort of left heaven and mated with the daughters of men. And these we're going to get closer to the Nephilim again, but it's always spoken of negatively. And let me bounce to a New Testament passage just to say this. Some people look at that passage and say, well, does it say that those sons of God are doing something wrong or bad? Well, the context clearly does, in my opinion. But there is more explicitness about that, what I would call the sin of the angels.
Can I ask you a question at that point?
Sure.
Which I can already tell this is going to be I have more questions than I did when the show started. That'll probably just continue to grow by the time we're done. But C.S. Lewis said, I am a spirit that has a body. Versus like sometimes we operate so much in this fleshly realm, but everybody's kind of instinctively aware that there's a spiritual nature to man. The beings that you're referring to, are they spiritual? I've heard an angel being a spiritual being that sometimes can push through the veil of this realm and manifest physically. And there's a few instances of tangible, when Jesus is born, or these kind of moments to the shepherds, these instances of angels or a spiritual being interacting in this realm. Those beings at that point, are they explicitly like angels cast from heaven as a punishment for this fall, or is that a whole nother thing altogether? And does that merge?
No. I was just going to go right into that.
That's where it kind of gets like all confusing on that, because we're obviously a dual entity. I'm a spirit human, but these have always typically been only spiritual beings only that kind of crave flesh.
Yes, but here's the thing. There's many, as I pursued this study, starting with Heizer, and then of course I expanded it to many other scholars as well. But then I wrote a book on it myself called "When Giants Were Upon the Earth," that has all my Bible study material about all this stuff we're talking about. But there are many concepts that modern Christians have that are not as biblical as we think they are. One of them is angels are spirit beings only. It's like, no, they are called spirits, but they are Elohim, right? They exist in this different realm, and they have a different kind of body than we do. And the assumption is they're only spirit. So therefore, how can they have sex, et cetera, right?
Right.
But if you look closely, there are many cases in the Bible where angels do indeed have a corporeal reality or a flesh to them, because the angels that visit Abraham eat the food that Abraham gave them. So they eat food. I would argue Genesis 6 says they can have sex with women. Some people disagree, but everywhere else, angels can come, and there's different ways of interpreting that. Some think that they take on flesh. I think that the Bible describes angels as they're a different kind of being. They have flesh, but it's heavenly flesh. And what that means is they can, with human flesh, we can only exist within these three three dimensions, right? We have a spiritual side, but but angels are interdimensional creatures in my understanding, meaning they don't become flesh and then become spirit. No, they are beings that are spirit, but they can move between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm in a way that we can't. And here's the biblical verse that will explain what you just asked and what I'm trying to say. Jude 6-7, and also 2 Peter 2. But Jude 6-7 is the classic passage. It says, and angels, he's talking about false teachers in the church and how evil they are. And he's trying to use examples from the Bible to show they're going to be judged, right? And he says, angels, there it is, that loose, ambiguous term. By the time of the New Testament, those gods, sons of God, that term is sort of kind of be convoluted with the generic term of angel. And this is just a function of language. Angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode. or residence, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. And then he talks about just as Sodom and Gomorrah, they indulge in gross immorality, pursuing strange flesh, served as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Now, this passage says a lot, and you link it with 2 Peter 2 because he talks about the same thing. And yeah, there's a lot of rabbit trails. I'm trying to keep us on one line here.
And that's Jesus' brother, right, Jude?
Yep.
So
yep.
like
and this
interesting dinner conversations they must have had.
Yes, absolutely. And 2 Peter, this is scripture, folks. So it's holy scripture, okay? So this is not made up stuff. And the point here is, where in the Bible does it talk about angels who don't keep their own domain in heaven, but abandoned heaven, and he's kept them in judgment? It's like nowhere. The only place that is anything like that is Genesis 6, which has that notion of sons of God coming from, wherever, from their heavenly realm, they come to the daughters of men. So there's a clear juxtaposition in the Genesis passage between heavenly beings and earthly beings. And the idea there is that the heavenly beings are violating a separation of creation that God has established. The heavenly beings should not cohabit or have sexual intercourse or that kind of unity with humanity. They're supposed to be kept separate. But those angels violated that separation, right? And then it says he keeps them under gloomy darkness, right? But there's something else connected to this. He says, just as Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, we all, talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, and most Christians usually focus on the homosexuality of it. And while I wouldn't deny that that's part of the evil of Sodom and Gomorrah, I actually think that Jude is telling us, at least for his particular theological point, that's not the most important thing for his point. He says that men indulged in gross immorality. Is that homosexuality? Well, let's see. Pursuing strange flesh. Now, the Greek there is heterosarx. Hetero, strange, different sex. That's not homosex. That's not homosarx. It's heterosarx. So the idea there is, what makes this, in Jude's point, what makes Sodom and Gomorrah sin, require the judgment? They were seeking after having sex with strange flesh. See, that's a human wanting to have sex with an angel, and that is something that in and of itself is a violation that also caused the flood. Now, this is a notion.
Wow.
This is not a notion this is a notion that comes up in a lot of what we call intertestamental Second Temple Jewish literature. The pseudepigrapha, the apocrypha, there are many passages that clarify and say, look, even if they're not scripture, they are certainly records of how the ancient Jews interpreted those Bible verses. And very clearly through multiple of these passages, they explain that. Well, let me give you a couple examples. The Testament of Naphtali. He says there's always a connection between Sodom and Gomorrah and Noah's flood. It's the same sort of judgment calling thing. And Testament of Naphtali says, discern the Lord who made all things. Do not become like Sodom, which departed from the order of nature. In what way? This way. Likewise, the watchers departed from nature's order. The Lord pronounced a curse on them at the flood. Who are the watchers? Real brief. I don't want to go down another rabbit hole, but the watchers is a term for the sons of God. And you get that you go to Daniel, and that's where the term watchers shows up in Daniel. And it describes in Daniel 4, I think it is, that again, these watchers are a term. It's kind of like, think of it this way. They watch over nations or peoples or authorities, because the idea there is that the watchers are watching over the nations, and they are these spirit beings that also are, like in Daniel 10, they are these prince of Persia, prince of Greece. They are princes over these various nations. They are spiritual authorities over these nations, right? I'm gonna prove that more in a second, but just to know that the term watchers is a synonymous term for sons of God or these angels that fell, right? And the ancient Jewish world clearly understood that. And even Josephus himself, Josephus is a famous first century Jewish Jewish theologian and scholar, and he talks about the same thing. Angels of God, accompanying with women, begat sons that proved unjust and despisers of all that are good, and whom the Greeks called giants, right? So it's the Jewish interpretation of this is very clearly that's what was going on. These sons of God. Now, there's one more component that's important to this storyline, and that is I mentioned these sons of God as being territorial authorities, like we see in Daniel 10, right? They are Prince of Persia, Prince of. What does that even mean, right? Well, this comes from another, what I call, what Mike Heizer actually calls the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. If you read Deuteronomy 32, and this isn't the only place, there's a lot of other places, but we've got to keep it brief for our talk today. Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 10 is the classic passage that really establishes this notion of what I'm talking about, that in the Bible, there are spiritual gods or these watchers, right, who are over in authority. They are over kings or cities or nations or peoples, meaning if there's an authority on earth, there's a authority in heaven over it, and they are linked. That's the notion. And here's what Deuteronomy 32 says, verse 8. When the Most High, there it is again, the Most High. You remember I was reading Psalm 82. It says sons of the Most High. That's the sons of God. It's a synonym, but it's the same thing, because sons of God, sons of Elohim, and sons of Most High. The Most High was Yahweh, and he was the Elohim that they were sons of, right?
Which is never questioned in any of your dialogue or in Scripture, that when Yahweh looks up, he sees nothing. He is the highest.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's no one like him. He's completely distinct.
And he's the creator of
and he's
all.
Eternal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
but man, he created a lot of stuff that we don't really have necessarily have a label for.
Here's how I made it easier for myself to accept this and change my modern mindset slowly to be more biblical, which is it was so troubling for me to use that word gods as a Christian, right?
Yeah.
So what I would say is, as I'm explaining to people things, I would call them divine beings, because that's sort of a middle term, right? Where it's like, okay, yeah, divine meaning they're supernatural, they're above us, but they're beings, they're created by God in some way, right? So, divine beings or heavenly beings is another synonym that you can use. If it troubles you to use that word gods, just use divine beings, because those are angels, right?
Supernatural, yeah.
Supernatural, yeah. So Deuteronomy 32:8, when the Most High, that's Yahweh, the creator, or in this case, El Elyon, names for the same being, gave to the nations their inheritance. What's inheritance? Inheritance is land. In the Old Testament and the ancient world, inheritance was land. So when God did that, when did he give nations their land? When he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people. Scholars will explain to you that the division of the mankind, fixing the borders of the people, that is a reference to Babel. When God divided the languages, he divided the nations. And you see that connection in Genesis 10. The nations, the 70 or 72 nations of Genesis 10 are the nations that are created when God separates the one people in Babel. That's when the nations were created. And in the Jewish mindset and understanding, the 70 nations were Gentile nations, and they did not know God. And in this passage, God himself says, I gave the nations as the inheritance according to the number of the sons of God. There it is again. Now there's some textual problems, because some translations will say the sons of Israel, and that's because they're basing it on older texts. But now, because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we now have more ancient texts of that original text that says it's the number of the sons of God. That's a whole nother discussion to explain, but sons of Israel wouldn't make sense, actually, because there's a definite division going on here. He's separating these nations from him and his people, right? It says, but the Lord, Yahweh's portion, his heritage is Jacob, which is a synonym for Israel. So he's saying, think of it this way. Here's how I thought of it that made sense for me. Man falls in the garden, right? And then he gets so evil that God has destroyed the earth. And then God starts all over. And then they get so evil that they build Babel, and God has to separate all of it. So mankind just won't stop worshiping false gods and won't stop trying to deify himself, right? And so God finally said, this is how I see it. God finally says, okay, you want to worship these false gods? The Tower of Babel was most likely a ziggurat, and a ziggurat was a holy mountain upon which man believed he made contact with the gods. At the top of the mountain in a sanctuary was where they connected with the gods. So this whole idea was the Tower of Babel was about connecting with the gods. And God's kind of saying, okay, if you're going to worship these false gods, I'm going to give you over to them. And you're going to be under their authority, but I'm going to have Israel and the lands, the various Gentile nations, that's the territories, right? Very ancient world is very territory land oriented. Of course, we still are, aren't we? Anyway, those Gentile nations will be under the authority of these gods, these sons of God, but Jacob will be my people, right? And then we go, as you read the Bible, you see God marks out his land that he's going to give to his people, that their inheritance, just like it says here, is going to be the land of Canaan, and they're going to take it away, and et cetera. So the idea here is, so the question becomes, well, what are you saying? Are you saying that, that these gods are all real beings? Yeah. And there are these watchers who are fallen, who disobeyed God, who violated the covenant. Now, the first ones in the flood were judged, right? The Bible says that God placed them imprisoned them, right? So what's going on here? Well, evidently, after the flood, there's still some beings who, according to Psalm 82, either they started out good, God gave them under their authority, or they were already bad, and God says, well, Gentiles are evil, so I'll give them over to evil spirits. Either way, that's the end of what happens is they believed, the Jews understood that the Gentile nations were under spiritual authorities over them. So this is why when you read the Bible, you see there was a war on earth and there's a war in heaven, because it's sort of like when there's an overthrow of an earthly king, you read prophetic language that says the stars fell from the sky, the powers from heaven fell. Remember I said earlier, stars are understood as divine beings. So they're saying when a king is overthrown, his spiritual divine powers are also overthrown, are thrown down to the earth, and are overtaken by other authorities, right? So that's kind of the picture that's going on here. And there's one other passage in Deuteronomy 32 that I just want to give as an explanation for one of the premise of my entire series.
See, Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 10, in that first part there, the worldview, and now
Deuteronomy 32, 17.
And just so you know, you already shot the rest of my entire weekend. I'm going to have to be just digging into all this stuff. Like, I don't know when I'm going to have any free time now over the next, because it's going to be sucked up with studies that you're just sitting, like I got all these launching points to go off into. So
Deuteronomy 32, 17 says, he's talking about the Jews when they went into the land of Canaan and they fell away from God, right? We know that they worshiped the gods of Canaan.
32, 17.
And he says, they, Israel, sacrificed to demons that were not God, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea there is that these gods of Canaan that they're worshiping are demons. Now, there's a whole history to understanding demons in the Old Testament. It doesn't quite mean exactly the same way that we understand the word now. That's another sort of, the language changes. But suffice it to say that word for demons, shadim, is also understood by scholars to mean these territorial spirits. Okay. But the point is that there's a spiritual reality behind those gods. Now, does that, so my sort of unique contribution as a storyteller and an attempt to do biblical research, I thought to myself, that's interesting because I've always understood the ancient mythology and all the ancient gods, gods of Canaan, Baal, Asherah, Anat, the gods of Egypt, the gods, right, of Greece. And I always thought of, those are just mythological, men made them up, et cetera, et cetera. But it seemed like, at least in some way, there's an indication in the biblical text that at least the gods of Canaan have a spiritual reality to them. What does that mean? Well, I thought, well, what if these gods of the ancient world that we know Like we have the mythology of Baal, we have the mythology of Asherah and Enoch and all this. What if they were these fallen watchers theologically, the territorial powers that the Bible talks about? What if they masqueraded and pretended to be these gods like Baal and Asherah, right? And of course, like I'm saying, there's some biblical warrant for at least making an argument for that. But I thought, in terms of story-wise, it would be very interesting to show their reality, even though it's a deceptive reality, right? So Baal, so maybe there's an entity, the entities over Canaan, Baal, Asherah, maybe there's some real spiritual demons behind those creatures, and they're pretending to be these gods, Baal, et cetera. They don't really have the powers that the mythology says, but they do have some supernatural powers because they're supernatural beings. And we read Joshua and we read how they conquered the promised land and all the demonic stuff that they had to encounter, right? So I thought, well, that's a fascinating tale that I wanted to tell. And that's sort of one of the foundations of my Chronicles of the Nephilim. Where you read my novels, you're going to read these gods as if they're real beings. And that's where people might say, wait a minute, is that polytheism? No, it's definitely the biblical monotheism, in the sense that these beings are at least masquerading to be gods of something that they're really not. They are created beings by God. And that's sort of what launched me into telling these stories, because that enabled me to make sense of, and through my stories that you read, I help make sense of the Bible in contrast and in interaction with these foreign pagan cultures and the gods they have. Because when you read the Bible, you see very much that Israelites often fell away, like over and over and over again, and they would worship Asherah, they would worship Baal. In Egypt, they were worshiping the gods of Egypt, right? So these things had real effect on the way they understood the world. So I wanted to bring an understanding of these pagan cultures that interacted and held bondage Israelites, but it also show how God himself overrides those and redeems that pagan culture in some way, right? It's sort of like you read Chronicles of Narnia, and Aslan is like, you see all these mythical creatures in Narnia, but it says Aslan is Lord of all, right? And he's the Lord over those mythologies. And you can have a pagan version or a righteous version. It's that kind of a concept. So that's what launched me.
These are characters. You got to bring them to life, like
so I bring Baal
like the screw tape letters or something like that, where it's kind of like they have personalities, and you kind of see their motives behind things.
And that was another component of it that I thought, we tend to. This is another preconception that we have. We tend to see these. There's not a lot in the Bible that is explained about what's going on in the spiritual realm with these evil entities, so we don't know much. But one of my biases, I always used to sort of think of the demonic realm as this army of demons, and they're completely unified, right? Because they're all trying to fight God, and they're and so we tend to see them as this unified enemy. But when we see now that no, they're individual watchers over individual powers, and the Bible describes that when Persia fights with Greece, the prince of Persia, that divinity, is fighting with the prince of Greece. So it's kind of like the mafia, right? The mafia leaders are jockeying for their own power, and they'll kill one of their own if it can help them get more power. And so I thought that's more realistic in terms of in the demonic realm, that they were unified in war against Yahweh, but every army is going to have its deserters or its ladder climbers that will deceive or overthrow others so they can get on top. So I bring that sort of a mafia type paradigm, if you could put it that way, into the spiritual realm,
which helps because Lucifer, let's say as an entity, as one being, like, he cannot be, my understanding, influencing Putin and Zelensky or something like this, and messing up my day at the same time. This idea of the devil made me do it kind of thing, because he's not God. He's not
everywhere present. Yeah,
right. There are layers and the expression like new levels, new devils, kind of stuff. It's like, well, it's like probably a different level of assignment against a president of a nation than there would be, somebody that's not making much of a difference, So, I mean, these kind of powers. And I don't tell me if this distracts too much. And I don't want to get into the whole Garden of Eden and bring that to life. But as a spiritual being, when you talk about this dual entity kind of beings, it's kind of a big question. But Adam walked with God in the cool of the day. It seems like a very physical interaction, of hearing, walking, talking. It's not like maybe, not in me on a walk hearing God's voice because I got into a quiet place. It seems like there was a version of Adam in a pre-sin environment and a version of Adam outside of the garden. What do you see as the change in him in that phase? What would we say would be the difference between Adam in the garden and David Whited in Missouri? As far as my level of my spiritual and my flesh, my physical.
Yeah. Physical and spiritual death. That's the big difference, isn't it? I mean, is that what you're kind of getting at? Or
yeah, like what was his capabilities? What was his obviously he's there isn't a death. He has no expiration date. So that would change things. But even like his nature, like, okay, say like a spiritual.
I know what you're getting at. It's like,
like his level of awareness of his spiritual nature, and it's like he is tethered to his flesh but it seems like a higher level of spiritual where we're more in our world. There's so much distraction and there's noise and we're so driven by hunger and sex and food and drink and sleep and money, and there's everything that human flesh is consumed with. It's almost you have to be intentional to wake it up that you even have a spiritual nature, a spiritual side, where Adam would have been complete in that space, and then outside the garden different, and then but there's also this angelic serpent type of interference that had to have been operating in that environment at the same time for him to have been tempted and for God to create something that he couldn't do, to have an element of free will and choice.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely an area of speculation, but it makes sense that if you believe that if we believe as Christians that the sin nature, became, entered into that world and spoiled it with death and whatever, spiritual and physical death. It makes sense to go, wow, what was his potential before that? That we talk about how we only use 10% of our brains. Well, could Adam use 100%?
Yeah.
Man, what a different world that could be. Absolutely. I have not spent much time thinking about that myself or speculating a lot, mostly because there's no revelation of what was like. And I'm not against speculation, but I do think that a lot of Christians spend a lot of time speculating about the things that are curious, but not as important as other gospel related things, that kind of a thing. And I would put this in that category where it's like, yeah, it's something worth like musing about. But when you create this whole scenario of, what it was like, a lot of Christians have written novels like that. Again, like I'm not against that, but it's just, it doesn't interest me because there's not enough information for me to be able to, my speculation, I write fictional stories, but they're based and rooted heavily in biblical research, historical research, and ancient mythological research. I want it to be rooted in something, not just made up because I'm thinking of it, entirely. But that's me, right? So no, I haven't spent much about that, but it does make me think of something that's kind of related, and that is that the point of this is another one of the Christian biases that we have that we don't realize is we just tend to think of there's one fall, the fall in the garden, and that was it, and that brought everything, and now I got evil and blah blah until now. Mm-hmm. But the Jewish understanding was no, there were actually 3 falls technically. There's the fall in the garden, and then there's the fall of the angels, which is there's nothing about angels falling before creation. Doesn't say anything like that in the Bible, but it does say that the angels fell coming from heaven to earth, having sex with women, right? Mm-hmm. That's a fall. They violated God, right? And that's a fall that ends up being part of what brought the flood. So it was, yes, the Bible says that man sinned, etc. But if you read Genesis, it also talks about the violence that is on all the earth is part of it. And that's what the Nephilim are a part of, is that violence. And so, and in Jude, it talks about the angels are punished because of it. So that's another fall. And then there's a third fall, which would be Babel. And that's where God judges. So there's this fall and man falls. And then there's this fall of Babel, that God then judges and spreads the nations out on all the earth and places them under these territorial powers, right? And by the way, this is where it goes into the New Testament. What does Paul talk about? We don't fight against flesh and blood, but against heavenly powers, spiritual principalities. He's not just using generic terms that are about demons. He's not saying we're fighting demons. He's saying these are spiritual principalities. These are the territorial powers who are over the nations that we are fighting with the gospel. Wow. Now that's another thread, but let's not jump down that thread at this point. But just to point out that this is part of that theme that weaves through, and there's an interesting conclusion to it that you'll have to really get into. You have to read my series, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, which is a story about the book of Revelation when it was written in the 1st century. And I tell the story of the origin of the book and all that kind of stuff. And that's where I bring in some of those elements from a very different perspective than I'm sure you
maybe we could do that as another independent show. We had on a guest for in this space, even though conspiracy conversations is kind of like, it's got a big umbrella, but Harold Eberle and Victorious Eschatology, and I think
he's a post-millennialist.
Yeah, definitely. He really gets into a lot of the 70 years after, the fall of Jerusalem in that space and how, breaking these things down. And it really, it really challenges people of what happened when, and so many things we attach now. It's like, man, maybe that already happened. Yeah. Okay, and so it's fascinating conversation.
Are you having a hard time sleeping at night thinking, what am I going to do about my finances?
Times are really changing. They're changing fast. Let me give you a quick example of how. In 1920, if you had a $20 bill and 1 ounce of gold, you could go into any men's clothing store and buy an entire suit. You could buy the jacket, the shirt, the belt, shoes, the whole bit. Today, that $20 bill, what's it going to get you?
Not much.
Maybe the socks, maybe a handkerchief, but the 1 ounce of gold could still buy you the entire suit at any men's store in America. That's the difference. That's what inflation does to your dollar. It's a deflating dollar caused by inflation. Now today, that's happening faster than ever. You need somebody that you trust that can help get you out of a fake currency and into something that's going to keep you safe.
And we know a guy that has 2 PhDs by the name of Dr. Kirk Elliott. We have known him for over 25 years, and he's someone we completely trust.
You need somebody that you can get a hold of, somebody that's going to be there for you to get back out of it, and then maybe back into the stock market, maybe back into something else when things settle down. But right now is not that time. You need somebody that you trust and somebody you can call and make those worries go away.
That's exactly right. So you can go to flyovergold.com, fill out your information for a free consultation, or you can call 720-605-3900. Do it today.
You'll be glad you did.
It's good to hear that you have that openness, because I'm in that camp. And so I was going to say, well, be careful, because you might end up concluding I'm a heretic after this, but I'm definitely more in that camp for sure. But I've been on plenty of shows, of futurist shows, who disagree with me, but they enjoy the discussions that we have. And I'm very happy to let's do that. Let's have a whole.
I love it. That could be a whole nother one. And you're too deep of a well for one show. Yeah. So okay. I'll squeeze all the juice out of that lemon I can today. With the series on the Nephilim, where does this story kind of begin? Okay. And I don't, you have to answer this question, but just answer it sometime in the dialogue. I've always been fascinated with the idea of timelines. I drew them out myself when the kids were little. My wife and I, we did all these, like how long Adam lived and then begat, and you could draw these things out. It's amazing how these guys were around at the same times. And I'm thinking Adam was in the garden. He would have been around almost, not all the way to Noah, but there would have been, we talked Methuselah and you get into these guys. They would have had access to at least his version of what things were like before. And it's just, it's an interesting idea that the Nephilim and these things that are happening in those times, enough to where it grieved God's heart to that extent. There were people that, because of lifespans, had direct access to firsthand information. Yeah, there's a kind of a chart, but those things have really fascinated me, and I'm interested in how you tie that into the narrative of the storyline.
You make a good point, and the truth is, despite what I just said about speculation, it's not like I don't engage in it. Like if you read my books, Noah Primeval and Enoch Primoridal, that's a prequel. That's like Enoch was before Noah, right? Mm-hmm. So I do actually have some fun, but I don't go all the way back to the garden because to be honest, I don't know. I just haven't had the interest in writing a book about that. Many people have written novels. I haven't found a way of telling the story that would be interesting to me. But I definitely go back into Enoch, and like you said, I have them, Adam and Eve are still alive in time of Enoch, etc. So I do try to wrestle with that, but I do so in a context of a genre of storytelling that I would call, sometimes you call it biblical fantasy. But what I like to say is I use the fantasy genre of storytelling as a means of communicating the spiritual world. So what I mean by that is I got some pretty fantastic stuff in my novels back in the ancient antediluvian world and afterwards that I'm not necessarily saying are literally true, but it's a way of me sort of telling the story that can communicate the spiritual truth. Let me give you an example. So Leviathan is one of my favorite characters in all the Bible. In fact, Leviathan ends up being a continuity creature throughout all my novels, but he's a bad guy. And I know there are different beliefs about what is Leviathan. That some Christians believe it's a dinosaur, or it is a literal creature, or something. But my study of that, and I've written an entire booklet on that called Leviathan and Behemoth, and I recommend that because it really brings all those passages together. But let me just briefly explain that the concept of Leviathan is that he is a mythological creature of sea dragon of chaos. And let me find here.
There is no dust settling on you. That's for sure.
Yeah. So
you're a worker.
So the thing about it is, we can go over many different things, but if you look at wherever Leviathan shows up, he's always this enemy of God, and God fights him. Well, one of my favorite passages is Psalm 74. God is talking about the crossing of the Red Sea and how he leads them, right? And he's using this description, and he says, the psalmist is writing to Yahweh, talking to Yahweh, saying, you divided the sea by your might, right? The Red Sea. You broke, as you say, he goes, you broke the heads, that's plural, heads, not one head, heads of the sea monsters in the waters. You crushed, the many sea monsters. Well, this is what he says. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. That's plural heads, singular Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You spit, blah, blah, blah. And so if you do a study of Leviathan, you see that this is one of the most interesting passages because the sea dragon of chaos is what I think it is. And does that mean that the Bible believes there really was such a thing? No. When the writers are talking about important historical events that have spiritual meaning, they'll imbue them with all kinds of mythological grandiosity. Don't be afraid of the word mythological. It doesn't mean it's false. It just means it's spiritual meaning. And so the Leviathan there has multiple heads. Well, if you look at all the other ancient religions, including Canaan, they all believe that they used the sea dragon with multiple heads, usually 7. There were 7 on the heads of the Canaanite Leviathan, and they all use it as a metaphor for for chaos, because he's in the ocean, which is the dark deep that they didn't know. It was just the sea was chaos to them, and he represents the chaos. So when God is pushing back the seas of chaos, he's crushing the heads, plural, more than one, of Leviathan. He's describing God. This is the spiritual reality. God is pushing back the chaos of the world, that is, the world without God. They left Egypt, right? And he's bringing them to Sinai, where he would give him his order. So it's chaos versus order.
Okay.
And actually, this is what I love. Jordan Peterson. He's talked a lot about this as well, chaos and order.
Yep.
And he's understood that Leviathan is that symbol. So he's symbolic of chaos all throughout the Bible. But I bring him into my series, and sometimes it seems like he's a real creature, but I'm using him in the spiritual realm to show this is what goes on in the spiritual realm, if that makes sense. So therefore, it kind of reads like Lord of the Rings, but it's the Bible. But when you read it, you get it. You say, okay, he's not turning this into mythological nonsense. He's, I'm showing the spiritual reality by using these monsters like Leviathan in my novels, as long as they're creatures that appear in the Bible. So that's one of the side roads that I definitely go down. But so we're going to be moving along here, because I want to get back to the Nephilim. So I've kind of talked about this whole spiritual powers over the nations, all this wild stuff. That's the stuff I'm like, I got to tell this story, because I didn't know this as a Christian, but now it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
So that's how I wrote my novels. But going back to the Nephilim though, then what's going on with that? So going back to Genesis 6, there's only 2 places in the Bible where the word Nephilim shows up. And it's important for your listeners to understand that Nephilim is actually what they call a transliterated word. What that means is, sometimes in the Bible there are words that they're either unsure or ambiguous, or there's too much debate over the word, so they just transliterate the original into English. And this is one of those words. And the reason why, I believe, is because they're afraid of saying giants, because they feel like Christians are going to think it's mythology, right? We'll go into that in a minute. But,
makes perfect sense.
Yeah, but there are many other words where that happens as well. And so here's the thing. And there's debate about, Nephilim means fallen ones. It doesn't mean giants. But here's this will answer 2 questions and move us forward. There's only 2 places where the word shows up. Nephilim, that is. And Genesis 6, which I described, and they were the result. So these divine beings, sons of God, are having sex with women, and the result is giants. And that would make sense too, because if the sons of God weren't angelic beings, and you're just describing a metaphor, you're saying men had sex with women and they had giants. Well, where did the giants come from? That's crazy. But if you understand it as being, no, these are heavenly beings who are having sex with women, and the result is giants, that makes sense. And it also connects to mythology, in the sense that mythology, all mythologies around the world, Greek and everything, have this notion of the gods having sex with humans. They get that idea from a reality, right? And this is where that reality comes from. But the way to the sort of the solidification of that is in Numbers 13:32-33. This is the only other place where the word Nephilim comes. Now, the context is, this is where they're about to enter the promised land, and Moses sends the spies, right, to spy out the land. And what do they do when they come back? We all know that they say, there are giants in the land. Well, here's what it says. He goes, here's what they say. They brought that back to people, a bad report, and they say, the land devours its inhabitants. Now, that's not just a metaphor. That's a metaphor for something more than, devouring is like you're a monster that's eating, right? Well, giants can do that, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. It wouldn't apply to just the fact that, there's a lot of warriors there. No, the land devours its inhabitants. So you get this strange language. And all the people that we saw in it are of great height. I guess he's literally saying they're giants. And he says, and there we saw the Nephilim, who are the sons of Anak. And by the way, that word is Anakim, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed ourselves like grasshoppers to them. So all the language there clearly talks about there being giants. They're men of great height, right? Now, here's another moment where I got to qualify everything and say, the word giants is a bad word to use. It's a sloppy word, in my opinion, or let's put it this way, it's a badly contextualized word, because when we hear the word giants in our modern world, what do we think of? I mean, let's be honest. We're thinking of Jack and the Beanstalk, right? The giants of all the movies and stuff. They're 30-foot, it's like, no, that's one of the misnomers. What people might say, you're ridiculous. The Bible doesn't have giants in there. It's like, well, no, the word giants is simply tall people. And we do know one giant. There's more than one giant in the Bible that we know his height. Of course, we know Goliath, right? And Goliath was like 9'6", right? So that's probably about the biggest they would get. But think of it this way. If your average height of an Israelite was about 5'5", if you're 6'5", like a basketball player, you're a giant.
Right.
That's a giant to them. So when you hear the word giants, don't think 30-foot tall beings. That's ridiculous. No. Just think like 6 to 9 foot tall warriors, basically. And this is another one of those things where we read these words and it makes us think falsely in a way, if that makes sense. So this is the only place where the word Nephilim comes. And by the way, Heizer goes into a whole explanation of how this proves that the word Nephilim means giant. It doesn't mean fallen ones. And
But
the reason why
they say and then reiterate that pretty clearly.
Yeah, I mean, it tells you, it describes them as giants, right? But even in the word Nephilim, the Aramaic version is used, as well as it comes up twice, right? And the Hebrew spelling of Nephilim is used, and then the Aramaic. And we know that the Aramaic does mean giant. So anyway, but that's again, these are just sort of proofs of these interpretations. But so here's where we have, now what's the point of this? This is where it's all connected. It's not just this strange thing. There's giants. Well, that's a weird thing. Think about it this way. And you have to, this is another study, but if you jump to the end of Joshua, you kind of, it's a summary. Like, what were they supposed to do? They're going to the land and they had harem, right? That was the ban. They're supposed to slaughter the men, women, and children of all the cities, right?
Correct.
Wrong. They were only supposed to kill the men, women, and children of specific cities and specific peoples, not all of them. Why is that? Well, I would argue because this passage is trying to say these sons of Anak come from the Nephilim. He is theologically messaging us and saying, these are the people we have to slaughter. And why is it just to slaughter them? Well, God said to, and so from a strictly logical perspective, if God says to kill anyone, he's right no matter what you think. But theologically, he's connecting these giant peoples, these Anakim, to the Nephilim. And we know that the Nephilim were the bad, right? The Nephilim were the bad guys in the flood. He's saying they come from them. So the giants that we are seeing now in our day, thousands of years later, come from those original bad guys that God destroyed the world from. Therefore, that's why they're unholy and we're supposed to slaughter them. And of course, so the harem and the ban and the specific cities were cities that had these giants in them. And the way that you can understand that is jump to the end of Joshua. So we won't have to go through all the details. Jump to Joshua 11:21. And that's where it's at the end. And it says, Joshua came and cut off the Anakim. There they are, the giants, from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, Anab, and all the hill country, blah, 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 blah. And there was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. So those are the ones he slaughtered. Now, it's important to understand that we'll look at some passages if we have to, but the Anakim is not the only word used of the giants. There are passages that describe Anakim as a word for the giants, so is Rephaim, so is Zamzumim, so is Zumim, and several others. But here's the interesting thing to note. So that kind of shows you that, at least contextually, from Exodus, whatever, to Joshua, the point of destroying those giant clans was because they are part of these evil hybrids, that come from before the flood. Now the debate then becomes, well, if they were all wiped out in the flood, how did they start over again?
Yeah, that's the question people, I'm sure,
it's a natural question, but there's several ways of understanding that, and I give them all in my books. Several options to understand that. Either the angels started to do it again, although they would have done so at great peril, because you know what I mean. Like it's not likely that they would, because they would be fearful of being thrown in prison. But it's possible evil beings will still, start to do it again, despite the possibility. Or it's not a global flood; it's a local flood. Now, hey, there's a lot of disagreement over that, but let's be honest. Orthodox, godly Christian scholars and men have argued for global flood and local flood. And that's a debate I don't want to get into, but I'm just saying that's a possibility. Or another possibility is that one of the wives of Noah, because if they started out with Noah, And another thing about Genesis 9, and it talks about Noah was a righteous man and he was pure in his generations. And it's important to understand that Noah's being picked out, but there's very specific language there in Genesis 9 where it says he was pure in his generations. What does that mean? That word for pure is the same word as used in the liturgical purity of like the spotless lamb for sacrifice. And so in the context of knowing that these sons of God violated women and these monsters are Nephilim, and that corruption is part of the purpose of the judgment, it's important for the writer to tell us Noah's not one of those. He's pure. His body is pure. He's not corrupted, right?
Do you think it was to a point where there were very few like that had a pure bloodline?
Yes, that would be the point.
Because man, they sure make a big deal of being able to trace Jesus' bloodline all the way back. That's much more than we do in our culture now, where it's my grandpa, my great grandpa. We don't spend a lot of energy on that, but boy, they dot every I and cross every T on.
And the point is that word righteous it's not righteous like we think righteous is doing good. It's like, no. First of all, righteousness in the Bible is faith, not good deeds. But regardless, the word actually is better understood as the liturgical word for physical purity. So there's that notion of that ties it in. But also, you just mentioned. Oh no, I lost my train of thought. What were you just mentioning?
But the bloodlines and Jesus' bloodline.
So that, and you're right. The purity of Jesus' bloodline is important, because that's what I'm arguing is the war of the seed. If you go all the way back to the Genesis 3 and the curse, right? Your seed will war against his seed. So my argument is in the Old Testament, what we see is the seed of the serpent, which are these, Nephilim in general, or specifically the Nephilim. But I also believe generally it's also the godless, it would also be the godless Canaanites and such. It doesn't have to just be the Nephilim, but the Nephilim are sort of the apex example of that seed of the serpent. They are the literal seed of the serpent. But then we also see that those in Canaan that worshiped these false gods are also, they're also evil as well. My point is I would argue that all the Canaanites could be considered seed of the serpent. Some would be literal, some would be spiritual, if that makes sense. But biblically, that's part of the paradigm of what's being told here is, this is what I believe. This is the point of, what's the point of these sons of God having sex with women anyway? I believe that's what it is they want to, that comes after the curse in the garden. So they're trying to spoil the bloodline of Messiah. And that's one of the that's one of the dominant themes of my Chronicles of the Nephilim and all my Chronicles novels. That's one of the dominant themes. They're trying to pollute the bloodline of Messiah. So they're trying to find out where's Messiah coming from, and let's pollute it. Let's kill them or whatever. And so that's the point of Genesis 6 is they're trying to pollute that bloodline so that Messiah wouldn't come, right? And so by the time they come up to, then the promised land and stuff, it's like, this is going to be our land and our inheritance, and it's got to be clean of the corruption that goes all the way back to the flood. And that's what God is doing, is he's cleaning this land, Of course, all the cries will come up, oh, that's genocide, or that's, racial genocide. No, it has nothing to do with that. This is not racial. This has nothing to do with racial.
It's a species.
Yes, it's species. Yeah, it's species. You can call it speciesism. I'm fine with that, right? Heavenly hybrids that violate the separation of God are unholy, considered unholy within this context of the Bible. And so
you mentioned briefly, then kind of went on, do you consider one of the most probable connections for that DNA transfer pre-flood, post-flood to have been from Ham, Shem, and Japheth's wives and what the bloodline they had possibly, and they carried post-flood?
Well, I'll tell you this. In my novel, I actually try to accommodate all the views to make it just out of no, really, to be interesting, or to be fair, because I have my opinions, but I think they're all viable. I really do. So I have them all. Yeah, if that makes any sense.
Because they were clearly, popping up again after, post-flood world, Goliath had brothers. There's also wasn't there like But Benaiah, he killed like a 7-foot tall Egyptian, 7 something, he's
We're
like
gonna get there. We're definitely gonna get
like
there.
they're like these guys are still around afterwards. So somehow there was
Absolutely.
they didn't wipe everything out.
First, I'll describe these other clans, and then I'll jump to because I do think that that's a good climax, is the David story and those giants there. But first, let me just say that the other passages that bring up these other giants, just to show you, it's not just the Anakim, and each of these words have histories behind them. But Deuteronomy 2 is where there's a couple of statements in verse 10. And later in verse 20, they talk about this. They say, verse 10, the Emim, they're talking about this location. I can't remember. The Emim lived there, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Emim. So right there, you see 3 terms used of the same people or the same beings, right? So Anakim, or like the Anakim, there are people who are like the Anakim, and they're called Rephaim or Emim, at least in Moab. And then Deuteronomy 2:20, it's counted as the land of Rephaim. But the Ammonites call them Zamzumim, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. So in different territories, they're called different things. So, you can call them clans if you want, but and the Rephaim is a very important biblical term that has a whole history behind it, and it's really fascinating. And I go into it in my Bible research books a little bit, but just to keep it short, Rephaim is sometimes, unfortunately, it's translated in the Bible in ways that you don't even know it's there. Like you read the word shades in the Bible, like shades of Sheol, and the word is Rephaim. And it's important to understand that it's not just talking about souls and Sheol. These Rephaim is a very specific term. And since I don't want to, make this go on for 4 or 5 hours, I'll just summarize it as this. The word Rephaim is a Canaanite pagan notion of the belief that the ancient kings of the land of the Amorites and Canaan were mighty warrior kings, these Nephilim of old, right? And they were so mighty that when they died, they went down into Sheol, and they were the mighty kings who ruled down in the underworld. And then the Canaanites believed that when some new king died, or when a king died and a new king was to take his place, they would have this ancient ceremony where they would call up the kings of ancient world, who are still, it's sort of like in their belief system, they believe they were ruling from Sheol, right? So they would call up their approval of the Rephaim, mighty kings of old, to get the approval of the new king. That's kind of their paradigm. So when the Bible uses Rephaim, though, it kind of it transposes its meaning and makes it something else. A lot of times the Bible writers will refer to these ancient pagan things and sort of give their own meaning to it. And this is one of those cases where the term Rephaim then is these mighty warriors. And so the Bible will use the term Rephaim and mock them, meaning they think that these shades of Sheol are mighty warrior kings. But you'll hear Isaiah say something like, but you are dead in a bed of maggots, and he mocks these mighty Rephaim. They're kings who are lying in beds of maggots. So it kind of mocks the pagan belief, but then it also uses the word Rephaim of some of these giant beings because they have that stature of being mighty beings who are Rephaim, who are these mighty kings of the ancient world, but they are wiping them out. They are destroying them. And in other words, it's showing that our king, our God, is more mightier than all these kings, right? So we're wiping. So after a period of time, the word Rephaim from the from the Hebrew perspective, ended up becoming a term that was referencing these mighty giants. And And so that's another term for them. So we see that there's multiple terms that mean giants, but you don't know it unless you read these passages. So that's when you do a study and you find all these other terms, you realize the Bible says a lot about giants. It's just that you didn't realize it because these names, Rephaim, Zamzumim, Anakim, there are words that are referring to giants. So there's a lot more about giants in there than you realize. So we've covered this in terms of telling the storyline. We've sort of showed the origin and then showed how, and then that's why in the Promised Land the whole point was to wipe those creatures out because they were on God's territory, and God had His territory, and the Gentile nations had their own. You can have your giants in your Gentile territories, but not on my land where I'm going to have the holy people, right? So God wipes them out. Then here's what Joshua, the passage we were reading earlier. Here's what he says. He goes,
this after the spies came back and they were having
I'm going back to Joshua 11. So remember I said that he wiped Joshua
11:21.
From everywhere. And I stopped, but I didn't continue on because after what I read to you was, after he wiped out the Anakim, he says, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. So it says Joshua wiped them out, except for in the land of Philistia. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that God had spoken. So it's saying that Joshua obeyed the Lord. They wiped out all these hybrid, corrupt beings to cleanse the land, but he left some. And that's a very common theme, isn't it, throughout the whole Bible, where there's this righteousness. They get rid of the Asherah, or they get rid of all the Baal worship, but they kept the Asherahs. So all throughout the Bible, it's this notion that there's this kind of righteousness, a kind of obedience, but there's always leaving some evil. And that evil is what grows up and becomes the next monster. And that next monster is what of course, you have the period of the Judges, and there's really, I couldn't find anything about Nephilim in the period of the Judges, but where the giants come back theologically in that I also bring out in my novels is David. And this is really important because what is David? Who is David? David is the Messiah, right? We think, well, no, Jesus is Messiah. Well, the word anointed one is Messiah, and David's called the anointed one. So Jesus is the son of David, so he is truly the ultimate Messiah of all history and time. True. But he is the culmination and full embodiment of that which David also was on earth. And so David was that king that was supposed to ultimately free Israel from the last of all these demonic things, right? And become the ruler over Israel, and all the glory. And of course, we know what happened to him, but and which is why he does something, but he doesn't quite do it fully, because one day the son of David will ultimately do what David could not do. But here's what David did do, and it's kind of interesting because this is one of these passages where a couple passages in First Chronicles and 2 Samuel, we read about several giants who are hunting David. Now, we all know the story of Goliath, and so I don't even have to go there yet, right? But here's what it says. Did you know that there were 5 other beings, giants, who were also hunting David?
No, I just knew he had brothers, right?
Well, that's what people say.
That's all I know about that.
Right. There's only one brother that the Bible says, and that's Lami. Let me read 1 Chronicles 24. And this is during the wars that David was having with the Philistines, right? Remember how it said, there were some giants left in Philistia with Joshua? Mm-hmm. And now the Bible is showing David and of course, the story of David is the story of him wiping out the Rephaim, ultimately. And remember, the valley of the Rephaim ends at the end of the story of David. And after King David, you never hear anything more about giants. Now, there is something about Nephilim in the days of Jesus, but we'll get to that some other day or later. But right now, the point here is that, so David is that Messiah, right? He's part of the seed of the woman. So they're trying to wipe out that Messiah, right? And there arose war with Philistines. Then Sibbecai, the Hushathite, struck down Sippai, who was one of the descendants of the giants. And the Philistines were subdued. So Sippai is the name of a giant who was killed. And he's in this battle against David. And there was again war with the Philistines. And Elhanan, one of the mighty warriors of David, struck down Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. That's where they get the idea that these other guys were Goliath's brothers. It only says one brother of Goliath, and that's Lami. And the interesting thing where they're trying to get that phrase is they keep using the phrase, the descendant of the giants of each of these men. But I did a study on that scholarly wise, and I found a scholar who made the argument that Hebrew phrase descendant of the giants is another technical term, Yalid HaRapha. And Rapha, remember Rephaim, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he made the argument that the language indicates that it was most likely a religious cult of assassins. He calls it a religious cult, but I make the conclusion that it's a religious cult of assassins because all these guys are trying to kill David. And David's mighty men are the ones that stop them. So Elhanan killed Lami, brother of Goliath, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Okay, so Lami was also a giant, shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Same language that was used of Goliath. And there was again war at Gath, and there was a nameless man of great stature, great height, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. That's where we get the mythology that Nephilim had 6 fingers and 6 toes, and they probably most of them did. Does that mean all of them did? I don't know, but this guy did, and that's one of the hints that he's one of these Nephilim. And he also was descended from the giants. He was Yalid HaRapha. And when he taunted Israel, this giant, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, struck him down. These were descended from giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. But there's a few more spoken of in 2 Samuel 21. And it says, Ishbi-Benob. Ishbi-Benob, that's Benob means son of a Ob, which was a necromancer. So his name he's Ishbi, son of a necromancer. One of the descendants of the giants, Yalid HaRapha, whose spear weighed 300 shekels. So he's another giant who was armed with a new sword, thought to kill David. This is where I get the notion that they're assassins, because it doesn't say this of all of them, but it's listing out the giants, and then it sort of shows the context, shows you that they're out to kill David. But Abishai killed him, and then men swore, you shall not go out to battle lest... So David was out in battle, and these giants were trying to get him, and then that's when they tell him, don't go out to battle anymore, it's too dangerous, right? And then it says there was again war with the Philistines of Gob, Sibbecai the Hushathite. We already, some people think that might be Sippai in the previous passage. But anyway, no, I was wrong. Sibbecai is a Jew who struck down Saph, who is one of the descendants of the giants. And so there are more. So in these passages, we see these multiple guys. Ultimately, I think there's 5 of them. And the point is they're out to kill David. Why? Because he's the seed of the woman and they are the seed of the serpent. So at least biblically, there's a theological message that's being communicated here. And like I mentioned, David ends up wiping out the Rephaim of the land, and he kills all these giants. And the concept there is the Messiah king killed all the Rephaim, but David did not fulfill his complete messiahship. So there's still more stuff that has to be taken place, which Jesus ultimately would accomplish. There's another one, 1 Chronicles. Oh, this is the only other place where another giant is actually, it's kind of interesting because it gives his size. 1 Chronicles 11:23. Again, it's talking about David's mighty men who are killing the people who are trying to kill David. Benaiah struck down an Egyptian, a man of great stature. Is great stature a metaphor for just mighty warrior? No, because it says he was 5 cubits tall. The Egyptian had in his hand a spear like a weaver's beam. There it is, the Goliath language again. So 5 cubits. Cubits are about 1.5 feet. So he was about 7.5 feet. That's the son of the giant. So
that's a big dude.
Yeah, a descendant of the giants. He's a big dude. And the point is that those are the giants. And there's more. There's actually more. But anyway,
how big's a weaver's beam? That comes up over and over. Do you have a footnote for that?
To be honest, I have the footnote in my book, When Giants Were Upon the Earth, but I've forgotten. I forgot.
Well, people need to go to Godawa.com, buy this series,
Yeah,
You'll know.
or at least buy the book. If you don't like fiction, this is one of the reasons why I give theology books too. I write theology books because some Christians don't like fiction; they just want to get the Bible study. And so, when giants were upon the earth is the Bible study of all this stuff, right?
Okay. Do your feet ache and throb in pain with every step you take every day of your life? Well, kiss those days goodbye with slippers from MyPillow.com. How about that flimsy, flat little excuse for a pillow that's nothing but 8 hours of disappointment, causing you pain in your neck every single night? You can wake up with nothing but butterflies and rainbows around your head with a MyPillow pillow. Those hardwood floors hurting your old bones? No more with a MyPillow dog bed. Are your towels worn thin, flimsy, more patchy than Joe Biden's memory? There's nothing better than absorbent towels from MyPillow.com. For all of these products and more, go to MyPillow.com and use promo code FLYOVER for up to 66% off.
But so I've now given you sort of a lot about. I mean, there's more. There's a lot more. But this is that basic storyline upon which is concluded in a way with Jesus as the Messiah. And I talk about this in. So first of all, my David novel is called David Ascendant. And, most David novel, when I write my stories, I'm like, I don't want to write the same story that everyone else writes, but I want to tell a biblical story. I don't want to just make something up. So my David story, I do have the David and Goliath scene, but that's not what it's about. I tell the story of these other 5 giants we were just talking about, how they are an assassination squad sent after David. And I tell the story of each one of them was killed. So that's kind of my unique contribution to the David story thing that you've never seen before. But of course, it's all biblical and it's all connected to the war of the seed, see? And so the question is, well, you see all this language throughout the Bible, actually. It's not just here. It's in many passages where this seed language is used, crushing the head and crushing the heel, or some say biting the heel, like Dan, is an evil tribe. They will be like a serpent who bites the heel. And there's
bruising
many,
the heel, crushing the head. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, actually, the word for bruising the heel is not It's not a different word. It's the same word as crushing the head. I'm sorry, crushing the head. The same Hebrew word, which is why I like to say crushing your heel and crushing your head, because translators will say bite or bruise your heel because it connects to the notion of a serpent biting the heel. But I think crushing is important because it's part of the
destruction
message.
too, a smush.
Yeah. And so you'll see other stories in the Bible where they'll talk about these different stories, and you'll hear this language of crushing the head and crushing the heel. And I think that's part of the theological weaving that's going into the story. But lastly, I end with, at least the Chronicles of Nephilim series, I end with Jesus triumphant. And I'll wrap it up pretty quickly. There's, we can go into a lot in there too. But, well, what does this have to do? There's no giants in the Gospels, right? Right? No, there aren't. Well, are there Nephilim or Watchers? Well, actually, yeah, there are. 2 components. One is the Watchers thing. So remember how I said that these territorial powers over the Gentile nations, right? Well, let's go back for a second to Psalm. Well, no, I won't go back there yet. We'll get there. But Jesus, there's 2 things that I bring out. One is in the Gospels, in the New Testament, there's a lot of references to demons. Now, the Apostle Paul in Corinthians does talk about how demons, those who sacrifice to false gods are sacrificing to demons, right? So there's the New Testament equivalent of that, what I said in the Old Testament, where the pagan gods have demonic reality behind them. They're not just mythological constructs, is my point. So there's that going on still in the New Testament. But here's the interesting thing. The Bible talks about demons. This is another notion that many Christians have a misunderstanding of because of the imprecise language of this word demons. and or the lack of details. And the demons are evil spirits. And one of the misunderstandings of demons is that Christians call them, yeah, they're fallen angels. Fallen angels, right? Fallen angels. And then that's where we get this concept of like, maybe in the Old Testament, oh, these angels fell, they're demons. Like, no, actually, that's not what demons are. Demons are evil spirits without bodies. They're looking for habitation.
Okay.
The Bible doesn't say where evil spirits come from. The only demonic possession in the Old Testament is Saul. He's haunted by an evil spirit, right? There's demonic language, obviously, but in terms of how we understand demons now, when we think of demons, we think fallen angels, but they're not fallen angels. Now, the Bible doesn't say unfortunately, the New Testament doesn't tell us where they come from. However, there is intertestamental literature that does argue that demons are actually something specific. Before I go there, I want to say this. Angels, so they're not fallen angels. Well, why do you say that? Well, because demons are spirits, evil spirits looking for bodies. But what did we say angels were earlier? Angels have bodies. They're heavenly bodies, heavenly flesh. That's what Jude said. They have flesh, but it's a different kind of flesh. It's not earthly flesh, but it's flesh. So a demon cannot be a fallen angel because an angel has a body. And so that's one of our common misnomers. And that's why these angels are these heavenly host beings and these watchers, and they are different creatures. Now, I would say they're demonic in the sense that they're evil, spiritual evil. But literally, the demons that Jesus are casting out of people, that's not what they are. So what are they? Well, the Bible doesn't literally say. However, the Bible quotes Bible quotes an intertestamental literature called the Book of Enoch. And where that's quoted is also in Jude. And that's where Jude says, Enoch says that, the Lord will come with 10,000 of his myriads of his holy ones to bring judgment. And he's literally quoting from the Book of Enoch. Mm-hmm. Now, there's all kinds of arguments that people make, why that, it doesn't mean Enoch's not scripture, but I don't believe Enoch's scripture. But if you look at the whole book of Jude, the whole letter of Jude, you actually find he's making multiple references to concepts from the Book of Enoch, not just that quote. But he's quoting from Enoch, which means you don't have to think Enoch is literature, but you do have to give it the kind of respect that the early church gave it. The early church, some believed Enoch, first Enoch, there's multiple, first Enoch, second Enoch, third Enoch. I'm only talking about first Enoch. But the early church, all the early church believed that the book of first Enoch was either scripture, or if it's not scripture, it's still legitimate historical or theological works that they can draw from. They respected it. It had some kind of authority, even if it wasn't biblical authority. Why did they do that? Because he's quoted and referred to in the book of Jude and multiple other. It's not a booklet, but it is an article called Enoch. The Book of Enoch. Heresy or scripture or heresy. But if you get my book, When Giants Were Upon the Earth, you will get a complete chapter on the Book of Enoch. And I explain a lot of this and why we as Christians, I used to think, only the Bible. And I'm sola scriptura in that the Bible is the sole ultimate authority. But that doesn't mean it's the only authority. And it doesn't mean it's the only book that says anything true. So it's like there can be truth in other theological works. How do we know it's true? Well, if the Bible quotes from this other literature, right, then at least you can say as a Christian, I don't believe it's scripture, but I believe there's legitimate ideas in that book, because the scriptural authors would not quote and refer to it from multiple cases. Jude refers to all these things. I explain that all in my
it's
book.
a common language they would have between each other, because if I said to you in this conversation, hey, save 10% for the big guy. Well, if somebody came 300 years from now and they looked at that, they would have known that was just a common slang that I would have said, and you would have known who I was talking about. You know,
Yeah, exactly.
So it would have been like something out of context, and I wouldn't even have to explain it because you know exactly everything that I was talking about in the case and the insinuation that's involved. And so I think if people are looking back on this, you would have to also know that I'm talking about that person.
And my chapter on Enoch in that book, it sort of describes my own personal journey. Because again, I'm an evangelical Christian who's kind of have tended to see the Bible as, you know, I'm not tended. I mean, the Bible is my ultimate authority for truth about God. And so for me, I had always had problems with the book of Enoch because, well, it's not scripture. But when I finally faced the fact that not only Jude, but several other passages refer to the book of Hebrew in the New Testament, refers and quotes from Enoch, I have to change my thinking on that. I have to at least say, well, okay, even if it isn't scripture, I have to accord it some value because the scriptural authorities are according it value, right? So if I'm going to be sola scriptura, I have to respect the book of Enoch. And I'm making all this argument because it was hard as a Christian. Again, I feel like we've been, you know, I come from a typical evangelical background, so I've had all the prejudices and biases that they have, and I've had to work through them all. And that's why I'm sharing these details in the hopes that others who are listening can not react so negatively. It's heresy or whatever, as many Christians often do, because they don't think through things. You know,
well, you'd probably been uncomfortable at a dinner table with Jesus and Jude, and you'd have been a little bit out of step when they're making references. You've been like, I don't get the joke. I don't get what you're talking about. You'd be this third wheel if you had that cut off from your thinking.
Now, the reason why I'm laying all this down is because in the book of Enoch, remember I said that the Bible does not say where demons come from. It just says they're evil spirits. But the book of Enoch does have an argument where the evil spirits come from. And the argument is they are the spirits of the dead Nephilim. Remember before the flood, remember the ones who died in the flood, remember they're hybrid beings. So what they believed was the demons that are floating around in the air, so to speak, I mean, their concept was, they're floating around in the air and then they're looking for bodies to inhabit. Well, think about this. If the Bible talks about when humans die, they go to Sheol or Hades, right? The Bible talks about the place of the dead. Of course, there's differences now in the New Testament, but nonetheless. And it says no one has ever escaped the place of the dead, right? So no man comes back except for those resurrected by God himself, of course. But so the idea there was, biblically speaking, evil spirits couldn't be human spirits, right? And then they couldn't be spirits of angels because angels are in the heavenly realm. And if I don't know where you get the idea that an angel could die and then his spirit, maybe you could, but the idea was that angels are intrinsically within that heavenly realm. Mm-hmm. But remember, if the Nephilim were hybrids of human and angels, then they would be this strange creature that as an angel, it couldn't go to Sheol because humans die and go to Sheol. But as a human, it's not like it would go to heaven. So where would it be? It would wander the earth because of the fact that it's a hybrid nature. And of course, it's malicious, as the Bible says the Nephilim were basically malicious, right? So that's where this idea of demons are the dead spirits, the spirits of the dead Nephilim. And here's why I think that's important. Well, what's the point? Well, so what I'm saying is I accept that as a strong possibility. Mm-hmm. I accept it as the best definition of demons, because there's no better definition of demons I can find anywhere. And it fits the theology of the Bible in this sense. Think about what I've been talking about. The war of the seed has been that the seed of the serpent, right? The Nephilim, the hybrid, the evil monsters, whatever, trying to stop the bloodline of Messiah. And David wipes them out physically. There's no more mention of giants after that, but they're still evil and there still has to be a Messiah, and the land is still polluted and corrupt. How How so? How is that? Well, not only were, there's a worship of false gods and stuff still going on in Israel, but when Messiah does come, he is the one that is cleansing the land for his rule. And if the Nephilim are dead spirits, that's why he has to cast them out and cast them into the abyss and get them out. He's got to do the cleansing of the land that was never fully done with David, see? And so he's doing what David did, but he's doing it in a final sense.
Wow.
But here's one more connection. How long have we been going here? I don't want to keep this going forever, but
we're great.
Are we good?
If people can't do it, they can break it up into
right.
chunks, or
Okay.
they can get a discount.
Okay. This is really cool. Oh, this is cool. So
I'm having a blast, by the way. My brain is just in party mode. Cool. Just learning all this stuff. It's so good. I wish you'd have been around when I was in grade school, and you could have been like my Bible teacher, because this is it makes the stuff that when you're talking about sin and all the things, this makes it in a context where you realize what we're actually trying to do here, and what the enemy really is.
Yeah. So, but remember how some people have pointed this out. The Old Testament doesn't really speak much about, it speaks about occultic things and evil, but there's not about demons and evil spirits running around. You know what I mean? There's no, like I said, there's maybe one possession at most that you really hear about. There's demonic things, but not like in the days of Jesus. You don't hear about that until Jesus comes, and then all of a sudden all these possessed people, right? And he's going on casting them out. Well, what's going on? Well, I think what's happening is they recognize the Messiah, the seed of the woman, has come to kill us. And so that's what, all of a sudden there's this rise of demonic possession that's going on in the arrival of Jesus. That's that sort of climactic final battle between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, and then and there's so many cool theological connections going on, but what was I getting to? So he cleanses. Now there's one other component going on here, and you know how the New Testament talks about how Jesus crushed the serpent at his crucifixion. So Satan thought he won, right? When he killed the Messiah, he thought he bit the heel of Messiah, and he was wounded, but Messiah rose from the dead, and he crushed the head of the serpent. So that's his victory over Satan and over death, was the resurrection. Now remember, this is also connected to all the Watchers. Well, what do you mean? What do you mean? There's also a culmination of the Watchers in the Gospels. Going way back to that passage, we were first talking about Psalm 82, where I talked about how God has given the rule over these Gentile nations as to these beings, these gods. And what does he say? You rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked, give justice to, you're supposed to rule justly, but you have not. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. That's metaphorical language. Foundation of the earth shaken is the spiritual destruction of what's going on. It's used constantly throughout the Bible. And then he says this, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. Remember that? You're going to be judged. You rulers of Gentile nations, you're going to be judged, and you're going to die like men. In other words, you're going to be killed and destroyed like men, which only God could do, right? We tend to think of angels or, these divine beings. Well, they're eternal. No, they're not. God can destroy them, and they're not intrinsically immortal. God keeps them alive, but God can kill them and destroy them as their judgment. That's what he's promising. When does this happen? Well, my argument is this. The very last verse of Psalm 82 says, arise, O God, judge the earth or the land. By the way, this is another one of the many misnomers of translations and Christians in modern English. The word earth is a bad English translation to use for the original Hebrew. Why? Well, because when we think of earth, what do we think of? We think of a globe, don't we?
Yeah.
We think of this globe in space. That's not how they thought of it. The word actually meant land. And the thing is, the word land could mean either dirt, you pick up land, dirt, or it often meant the land of Israel. Or it could mean the land, all the land that you see, because they didn't know about a globe. They just thought of whatever all the land is. That's what. Now you could argue, well, that includes the globe, even though they didn't mean the globe. But the point is, they don't think in terms of globe. It's the land. But nonetheless, arise, O God, judge the land, for you shall inherit the nations. Now, remember when I said inheritance? The sons of God inherited the nations. Now he's saying, arise, O God, judge, you shall inherit the nations. You shall take away the inheritance that has been given to. So the judgment is he's going to destroy them and kill them and disinherit them. Take away their inheritance of, and what was their inheritance? The Gentile nations. Now there's a key word here that says, arise, O God. And that word in the Greek Septuagint is anesti. Anesti is the same word used of the resurrection of Christ. And the Apostle Paul in passages will often refer to that. He will quote Old Testament passages that talk about, God will raise a standard. And he says that's the resurrection. So I believe this is basically saying that when Messiah comes, he will raise from the dead, and through his resurrection, he will inherit the nations. He will disinherit all those territorial powers. And this is what is the gospel. What does the gospel say? Before the Messiah came, all the nations were in bondage to these territorial powers, and only Israel had God. And they were in bondage. They were under their authority. But when Messiah comes, what does it say? He will include the Gentiles by faith in, that's the gospel, right? Gentiles will come into the family of God, come into Israel, and by faith, they will become one. So what does that mean? Well, when Jesus comes, through his resurrection is his power. That's when he disinherits the nations. It's kind of like this. Imagine that these sons of God, territorial powers, all had deeds. Like, you have a deed for land, right? Or a deed for your house. Well, Messiah, through his resurrection, takes those deeds away from them. You no longer have power over the Gentiles. They're no longer in darkness. And now I will bring them into my kingdom. Because think about it. All the world was darkness and under the dark powers until Messiah comes. He destroys the dark powers through his resurrection, and he takes away their inheritance so that men and women from every tribe and every tongue and every nation shall flow into the kingdom of God. I mean, all those passages, that talk about, God is not a respecter of persons, men from every tribe and nation. Well, that's the gospel, because before Messiah, you would have to become an Israelite to come into the kingdom of God. But now with Messiah, through faith, everyone from every tribe and nation. Does that make sense? So what I'm saying is,
my brain's just thinking of all kinds of examples and stories. Yeah, that's exactly right.
The Gentile nations are no longer, the gospel is this. The gospel of Jesus Christ is that the nations are no longer under the authority of these sons of God. They are now free to come into the kingdom of God through faith in Jesus Christ. But before then, they were in bondage. And isn't it true? And then the gospel exploded after Jesus rose from the dead, and it's filling the earth, right? And people are becoming Christians. And that wasn't the case before, when it was just Israel, was it? Like, Israel was just this one lone nation, and sure, you would have an occasional convert, but it didn't spread to all the earth and everyone becomes, right? Well, that's what Jesus did as Messiah. And that's the culmination of the storyline that we've been talking about this whole time, and how it all is all connected. And that's the storyline that I try to embody in my retelling of biblical stories, with this information that's there, but a lot of us don't necessarily see it there. And many, many people have told me, Brian, you've made the Bible come alive to me again. In fact, I was getting bored with it, but this has made it come alive. And that's been my goal in my heart, because that's what happened to me. When I saw the storyline, it didn't tell me anything different from the Bible or new. Right. It wasn't like, what I learned was wrong. It was no, it filled it out in a much more fuller way that's transcendent and raises above just the sort of typical things that I tended to believe. Yeah. And it's a more supernatural worldview of the gospel as well, in my opinion.
What's the way, just this last spring, our family, we all went to Israel for 10 days, on a trip. And so you see places. Well, it makes things come alive in a new way, because now you have a context for where somebody was standing and geographically where it was. And it makes it, and that's what, your conversation today has done, I want to dive into these books, especially that Psalm 82 book, the Divine Counsel. These things, like you take scripture but put it in a context that gives it great. This idea of territorial powers and Jesus breaking that off, which pulled the veil off or enabled the gospel to go into all nations, like that makes so much sense, and it gives a purpose beyond, because salvation is such a personal thing. That's what makes Christianity a unique thing. It's not like, okay, because I'm a part of a group. It's like, okay, I personally have to ask Jesus as my personal Savior. My wife can't do push-ups for me. She can't stand before God for me. Like it is my own thing. But also our call from really the beginning of time is go and multiply and subdue the earth, was the original call, but it sounds like that was interrupted a little bit with then, okay, I'll give you over to these regional powers, which then ties into Jesus making a new thing possible to share the gospel, the good news that now his authority can go into all spaces, and we don't have to be grafted into something new, that it pulls into all people, all tribes, all tongues, all languages.
Yes, and what my particular gifts and talents do is just my ability is I'm all for doctrine. Doctrine is basically truthful statements about God and reality in us. But I also recognize that doctrine can be boring for some people, because it's just sort of like, learning this statement is true, this statement is true, whatever. Some people have a hard time grasping doctrinal truths. So what I try to do is I try to show the story of doctrine. I try to embody the doctrine into the story, so that it's a story of truths that you're actually entering into. It's not just, okay, I believe this right thing, whatever. But if you understand the story, it makes all those doctrines come alive within the story and the narrative, that we are narrative creatures. We're storied creatures. Yeah. And I think we need story to incorporate the doctrine, and I think it becomes much more rooted and deeper than just these statements of truth. You know what I mean? That's been my been my heart and my calling, I think.
Well, I got cards and cards here full of notes, and a lot of work to do ahead of me. One of them is going through these books, but as kind of as like an addendum to the movie here, a bonus feature on the DVD, so to speak. What message would you say this has for people alive right now? And then how would you say these concepts apply to the struggles that are going on in the world? It seems like there's been a push for a one world government globalist kind of view going back to Old Testament. It seems to be the push now. It seems to me very encouraging to realize that, man, there was a Nephilim put, there was all of these things, and like, good has prevailed, and there seems to be like we're at the peak of a new wave, and maybe everybody in every generation feels like they're at the peak of maybe you felt that way in World War II. I don't know, these different generations, but it feels like there is clearly a good and evil war at place right now on the earth that feels like a crescendo, like the place before, almost like something busts, like if you ever seen like a bodybuilder blow up a hot air balloon, or a water bottle until it gets to, like, you feel like it can't get any bigger. It's going to pop. Like you feel there's that kind of tension right now. What message do you have to people that feel that? And they're saying, what relevance does all of this have to my life right now in the world we're in?
Well, I thought I had all the time in the world. I didn't realize how long we actually would go, but I actually have a date with my wife, which is far more important to me than this. So I'm going to have to wrap it up real quick.
I would love to revisit that question with you at some point. Because
absolutely. And it is important. In fact, it's related to the eschatology. So let's talk about that on the eschatological thing. But in general, I would just say, we've been here many times before. Look at history, right? Mm-hmm. The precipice of World War II looked like the whole world was going to blow up and die, but it didn't. We had victory. So history has ups and downs, and I would agree that there's a lot of pressure, and it looks like things are. But we've been here many times before, and I do think ultimately the way out is through the Church of God, becoming obedient to Jesus Christ, preaching the gospel and living out and obeying the commands of Jesus in our lives. That's how we're going to ultimately fight whatever happens, whatever comes our way. But let's talk about that definitely when we talk about the eschatology for sure.
Brian, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to show your website one more time before we close out here. It's Godawa.com, G-O-D, then AWA.com, G-O-D-A-W-A.com.
And just to let people know too, all my books that I've written are most all in ebook, Kindle, paperback, and audiobook. But it's exclusively at Amazon because that's the only way I'm able to make a living is to be exclusively on Amazon.
Okay.
So that's where you can go to buy any of them.
Yep. And then we got that pull up here as well. We'll put the links directly to the Amazon page within Amazon that has your work on it at the links. Every platform. If you listen to this on Apple, it's in the show notes. If you're listening to this anywhere, Rumble, wherever you're at right now, the links will be down below to go directly to his work, directly to his website. I encourage you to sign up for the newsletter to be a part of what he has ongoing. And I just got to kind of blackmail you here while we're on camera. Will you come back for part 2? This demands a sequel. It demands a sequel. All right.
As soon as possible.
Sounds good. Brian, thanks so much. Have a great date, and we appreciate your time.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
We will shut you down. We will cite you. And if we need to, we will arrest you and we will take you to jail. Period.
I wasn't thinking of the Bill of Rights when we did this.
But no amendment to the Constitution is absolute.
God actually spoke to me. He spoke about sacredness. He said to me, Kim, what I place in many, many people is sacred. And if anybody touches what is sacred to me, then it is the end for them. So what I've done in the United States of America is sacred. And there are people on every side that are trying to destroy what I deem sacred. And it's not going to happen.
This is the definition of criminal conspiracy, racketeering, and collusion. This is not a theory. This is evidence.
Because I have upheld this country to spread a light to the rest of the world. When you choose to go against the sacred thing that God put into the very heart and the soil of this nation, this was sacred to God.
This ReAwaken tour is literally what it means. It has reawakened the American heart.
Are you having a hard time sleeping at night, thinking, what am I going to do about my finances?
You know, times are really changing. They're changing fast. Let me give you a quick example of how. In 1920, if you had a $20 bill and 1 ounce of gold, you could go into any men's clothing store and buy an entire suit. You could buy the jacket, the shirt, the belt, shoes, the whole bit. Today, that $20 bill, what's it going to get you?
Not much.
Maybe the socks, maybe a handkerchief, but the 1 ounce of gold could still buy you the entire suit at any men's store in America. That's the difference. That's what inflation does to your dollar. It's a deflating dollar caused by inflation. Now today, that's happening faster than ever. You need somebody that you trust that can help get you out of a fake currency and into something that's going to keep you safe.
And we know a guy that has 2 PhDs by the name of Dr. Kirk Elliott. We have known him for over 25 years, and he's someone we completely trust.
You need somebody that you can get a hold of, somebody that's going to be there for you to get back out of it, and then maybe back into the stock market, maybe back into something else when things settle down. But right now is not that time. You need somebody that you trust and somebody you can call and make those worries go away.
That's exactly right. So you can go to flyovergold.com, fill out your information for a free consultation, or you can call 720-605-3900. Do it today.
You'll be glad you did.
For more great content, go to flyoverconservatives.com.